I love your book. It's so good, so harrowing.
Thank you.
I imagine it's very difficult to market something like that.
It is.
Farah Ghafoor is an award-winning poet and writer based in Toronto. Born to Pakistani immigrants in New York, she was raised in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and Windsor, Ontario, and earned her Bachelor of Management and Accounting from the University of Toronto. Her debut collection of poetry, Shadow Price, explores the idea of value at the intersection of capitalism, colonialism, and climate change, and is forthcoming next month from House of Anansi Press. Tell me more about your educational background and how you fell into poetry.
So I fell into poetry basically in the second grade when I found a haiku in one of the summer workbooks that my parents would bring home during the summer so I could get ahead in school. And then as I grew up, I really enjoyed winning poetry contests in middle school. And so that lust for winning really propelled me into writing more in high school. And but I eventually, I guess I kept going because it just felt very easy and confessional to me at that time, high school poetry. And I also realized at that time that there's a whole world of poetry online through literary magazines and journals and contests. And that's when I also started writing more seriously. But I took a sharp turn into accounting when I realized that I didn't want to study poetry in my post-secondary education because I hated being told what to do. And I felt like I wanted to keep poetry very fun and very easy for me. And so that meant not following anybody's deadlines and not writing in form if I didn't want to. So I chose accounting then because I was also interested in business and also because it's obviously very stable.
That makes a lot of sense. How do you think your work as a financial analyst impacts your poetic process?
So I would say that my day-to-day work doesn't really impact my process, maybe only in a way that it reminds me how business decisions these days are completely guided by money and by minimizing taxes. But I think in general, I'm just more interested in economic theory than crunching numbers. And that's essentially what I do day to day.
I love your book. It's so good, so harrowing.
Thank you.
I imagine it's very difficult to market something like that.
It is. I mean, I'm lucky my publicist is so good, which is why she's doing the bulk of the work marketing it. But I'm also really glad that people are interested in this kind of work now. I feel like it's never too popular to talk about money or like grief in terms of climate change. But I think general audiences are moving towards more climate fiction, more climate poetry now. So I think I'm publishing this in a really good time, actually.
That's great. I'm really glad to hear you feel that way. Tell me how Shadow Price came to be.
So in my early years of undergrad, which was 2019-ish, I was having a lot of anxiety about climate change. And I started writing these very anxious and very angry climate poems about the state of the world and how everyone is complicit in creating this world for my generation. And I felt like it was mostly because of previous generations not really paying attention to how it felt like the world was ending. And at that time, I listened to a interview with Andrew Snare Magnuson, and his work, he had written a nonfiction book called Time in the Water. And so what was very significant about that interview was about how he described turning, imagining large swaths of time, like centuries, as tangible things, like human lives. And that got me thinking about how we do have a bit of time before things are uninhabitable. And I think that did manage some of my climate anxiety. And so that metaphor of, he uses a central metaphor in his work of his grandmother and his daughter sitting at a dining table and having his daughter calculate when his grandmother was born and when his granddaughter might, how long she might live. And so that swath of time was about 200 years. And that got me thinking about turning time into tangible things in our lives. And that's how the first poem, the oldest poem in the book, came to be, and that was The Dream Eaters. And that poem actually used to be called End of the World poem, which kind of shows how I was feeling at the time. It felt like the end of the world, but I was writing those poems for a long time, maybe about a year, it felt. And that was my focus time. And I eventually compiled those poems into a chapbook called End of the World Poems in 2021. And so I submitted those. And so I submitted those poems through the chapbook to a couple of American presses, and I got rejected. And it was a bit too long to publish in Canada, even though there was some interest. So I guess I just kept trying to explore this idea, and I wasn't too invested in the idea of a chapbook because I wanted to just publish my work. So I was okay with continuing to explore the theme of climate change and complicity and time as I then started working towards a full-length collection.
Since you touched on it a little bit, can we talk about the submission process? I'm really curious to know how editors responded to this.
So I only submitted to a few Canadian presses because I was interested in having it published in Canada, because I'm based in Toronto, and I felt like it would just be a lot easier to have all the events here and the launch party and all. And I was very lucky that the few presses that I submitted to, they were all interested in the manuscript, because I understood that it was also a very heavy topic, but they appreciated how singular the vision was of the book, because it felt very fully formed at that point. And I was eventually I selected House of Anansi Press because I think I just appreciated how well established they were and how well their books do generally. And I also knew that their poetry editor was really good because I knew somebody who also published with them.
So obviously the book has some really dark themes throughout. I wondered if you could speak a bit about how you write about these things without falling into despair or hopelessness.
I think it's still hard to not feel hopeless sometimes, but that's also why I was writing such angry poems for such a long time. And I think that might be why that chapbook didn't get accepted. It was full of exactly what you said, despair and hopelessness. So what I eventually started to do was channel the emotions related to my climate anxiety and my doomism at the time out of my poems, and I pivoted towards education. I think my priority then was to communicate with the reader regarding the significance and a different way to understand the climate crisis, because I feel like readers and just people in general, they don't respond very well to anger and hopelessness. And I felt like if I was going to sustain this writing practice and this writing practice of, well, generally my writing practice and also the themes that I was interested, I also needed to make my process a little less emotional. And that was for my own mental health and for the readers that I hope read the book.
On a similar note, I also noticed a lot of quiet humor and lightheartedness throughout, which really stuck out to me because of the otherwise often devastating themes. Could you talk a bit, just like craft-wise, about balancing realism and whimsy in your poetic process and like in your writing in general?
Absolutely. I'm actually so glad that my humor is getting across in my poems. That's such an accomplishment for me because I just don't want my jokes to fall flat. And I feel like this is also a big reason why I pivoted out of those angry and those anxious poems, because I needed to communicate the reader. And the best way to do that also is through humor and through fantasy. And I guess that's why we have dark humor, because we need to keep living and we need to keep reading. And at the end of the day, I think that's how you get through to people. And I think communicating with the reader is a big part of my process and my intentions with the book. Yeah, I think that's it.
I love that. It makes a lot of sense. I also really love the title. I think it's such a great title for this project. Can you talk a bit about how that came to be? Like, at what point in the process did you arrive at that title?
So I got to the title when I actually wrote the poem Shadow Price. And so that was in, I think, my last year of undergrad, so 2022. And I came upon that term in my healthcare economics class. And so the context of that was calculating co-insurance and like related work. And it was just so fascinating to me at that time, because to study the economics of something like healthcare, which is a human right, is necessary, but it also feels it's such a capitalist thing, because, as I said, healthcare is a human right. And after writing that poem, I realized that, like, this is the way money is moving the world toward, like, continuing the world and pushing it towards further, like, late capitalism and furthermore, the climate crisis. And so that's why I wanted to also push the manuscript into that direction, where I sort of lower the intensity of the poem and I explore the topic of complicity and blame and sort of let those themes simmer in the book until the reader naturally arrives at that conclusion. That's how I sort of started developing the themes that I wanted to tackle in the book. Because at that time, I had mostly written the poems in the time section, and I had some of the poems in the other section, but I was having a more difficult time trying to see, like, how I would order them in the collection and what was missing and what still needed to be written. And so I think that's also when I realized in the process of writing the book that I wanted poetry that wouldn't continue to ask questions and instead would provide answers. Because if all the information is already out there about the climate crisis and everything, then I felt like there was no need to still be answering questions. So writing Shadow Price was, for me, like the establishment of my intention to start providing answers.
How do you think being born in the year that climate change denial first appeared in print impacted your life and your poetic practice? More broadly, what is the impact of something like the collective naming of a dark phenomenon? What is that impact on a life?
I think it's defined my life and practice in a major way. And I think it's similar to, it's not exactly, but it's similar to how poets born in a war have that sort of shadow of a war over their lives in a way that it defines how they treat money, how the economy in their own country is, and how the priorities of the public around them have changed and how they continue to transform over the course of their lives. And it's also made me very aware of not only how transient life is, but also on a larger scale, how temporary the world is too in real time. I think I'm going to be continuing to write about the climate crisis for the rest of my life because the crisis isn't going anywhere and it's going to continue having that shadow over everyone's life, everyone who was born in the last 30, 40 years.
You delve into this a little bit, but can we talk more about the book's development and organization? Because I thought it was so unlike any other collection I've ever read, just in terms of like how it was constructed. Like at times it didn't even feel like a poetry collection. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. So each section of the book came together like very independently, I feel. I talked about the section time already. And so basically that was when I was trying to make sense of the climate crisis for my own sanity, very early in the development of the book. And the next section of the book would be The Last Poet in the World. And those vignettes, in my practice, I write vignettes very often and frequently. They sort of come about when I'm free writing. And so those came together over time, over a number of years. And when I wrote The Last Poet in the World, I felt like I was able to string those sections together into a narrative, and I was able to have the title poem, The Last Poet in the World, for that section. I was able to have it sort of display the internal and external role of a poet. And the plot was written during the last few weeks before my editing timeline, because I was really procrastinating on this poem because I knew it would be so much work, but I knew it would, and the book would be missing like a large, very important consideration of the colonial aspects and the colonial history of climate change. So the next section was The Garden. Those poems also came together independently over a number of years. And I was able to put them together because I felt like they also didn't fit in the other sections of the book. I was very intentional about what I wanted to include in the book and what topics I wanted to cover, because I wanted a book that people can learn from and a book in which they can recognize themselves and their own role in the world. But also I wanted some of the poetry to be accessible and have more common themes, like appreciating the beauty of the world and grief over the places or the species that are disappearing due to the climate crisis. When I was building this manuscript, it felt like I was putting together a house, maybe, because I wanted it to be very structured and I needed all the essentials there for a reader who both didn't really read poetry and somebody who reads poetry a lot to come to this book. And I wanted them to be welcomed into this book, even though the themes are so heavy.
It was so interesting to me how often the speaker acknowledges her own role. I felt like that was really unique to do from like a climate change perspective. Can you talk a bit about how you manage that from a craft perspective?
Yeah, of course. So I did that in a few ways. I used the first person. I also intentionally wrote out the speaker's thought process, and especially in The Last Poet in the World, because I wanted to include the way one corrects himself in their mind, because that's how you grow and that's also how you learn to manage your thoughts. And it also defines the way we create narratives in our own lives. And I felt like this would be a way to humanize the speaker to the reader and by acknowledging both the readers and the speaker's flaws, it would have the effect of the speaker saying, oh, we're in this together. I'm like you. We're both stuck in the climate crisis. And those were two main ways that I had the speaker acknowledge her own role. And that I think that was also evident through all the vignettes, especially in the plots and in The Last Poet in the World.
Speaking of The Last Poet in the World, can we talk a bit about the value of poetry under capitalism?
Yeah, so to me, the value of poetry and the poet is, at the end of the day, to tell the truth, and that's the truth about everything and conveying the truth to the public and to authority. And it's particularly important, I feel, nowadays to speak the truth about the world as it is, and specifically who is causing the future to be less sustainable. And I feel like the way it's encouraged often now in poetry, or at least when I was growing up, is that you can sort of write about flowers, but not who's stepping on them. I think poets used to be and still are political prisoners. And that's why it's so important to continue telling the truth through poetry. And I think especially in The Last Poet, the speaker is grieving the uselessness of poetry. And by doing so, they're also, in a sense, abdicating the responsibility of poetry. And that's to say the unpopular thing, and maybe at times the illegal thing. And I think we see in the first poem, the poem that leads the section, it's that telling the truth in front of authority not telling the truth didn't change their eventual end, but how they continued to live at the cost of their self-respect. And I think truth and self-respect are very, very much tied together.
You touched on this a little bit, but can we talk about what you think plot can teach us about these themes? Because plot sounds like such a cross-genre term that you don't really see a lot in poetry, but it forms a major part of this book. So love to hear what you think about plot just from a craft perspective and how it informs these themes.
So I think what plot can teach us is that everything is malleable. And what's really important when talking about stories and narrative is that the truth depends on who is telling it. And that's why it's extremely important for individuals to be critical of every public and private narrative. And plot is something that is supposed to be made up. But plot is also how we view history. We tell stories, and we continue to tell stories of the present and our own lives. And even though I think bringing plot into poems and exploring its potential and its use it feels very essential, because to interrogate craft and to interrogate the basics of poetry and was teaching poetry, I think it's very important to explore in poetry, because poetry has that flexibility. It's able to tell stories and also tell the truth, and it's also able to interrogate the facets of our everyday lives. And that is sort of, I think, inherently entwined with plot in our lives.
Another hard question. A particularly devastating moment for me, and I'm just going to read this quote. I write these words, and the poem ages with me. What precedes translation is the admission that language is the vestige of all we did not say aloud. What do you think should be said aloud in 2025?
So I feel like environmentalism has for a long time been maybe not a priority, but something important to the public. But back then, maybe like in the 70s and 80s, what we didn't say aloud was regarding the complicity of all people living in the global north, especially people who are living and benefiting off of being citizens of the richest countries in the world, of the US empire too. And now that we have a language for it, now that we are able to see how each of us impacts the global economy and the future, essentially, with even like every single dollar that we have, I think this is what we should continue to say aloud, because now that people are becoming more aware of their own role in the world, it's very important to be transparent about that and basically the consequences of each and every one of our decisions. Because basically something that I read a few years ago was that somebody making $90,000 or more in the US is considered the top, like one of the top 10% of earners in the world. And so, yeah, the US dollar and also the Canadian dollar, they're so powerful for not great reasons. And that's something that we should consider when we're talking about how complicit we are in the climate crisis and how consequential everything we buy is and how we spend our time and money. So I think the consequences of living our lives as we do and of the status quo, I think those considerations should be talked about aloud.
What do you most hope to take away from reading this book?
I think what I want people to take away most is how they have agency and how they live their lives. Because I know it's very popular to talk about how influenced you are by your surroundings and by media, but at the end of the day, it's up to the individual to accept it. And especially because we are living in the global north and we have more power than probably anybody else in the world to make an impact on how the future is going to go.
Do you have a favorite poem in the book?
I do have a favorite poem. It's The Whale. And I wrote this poem at like right before my editing deadline last year. And I was sitting on that information for at least a year or maybe 2 years because I didn't really have anything to connect it to. I just was really fascinated by that information, but I didn't have enough grounds or additional information to really write the poem until last year when I came upon the phrase belly of the beast. And I thought, oh, this makes sense. Things are coming together. And then I read that Ursula quote about how rulers used to, let me read that quote again, about how we are ruled by capitalism now, but we used to be ruled by the divine right of kings. And so if whole civilizations, whole societal structures can change, then maybe we can work our way out of capitalism too. Maybe not work our way, but make our way out of capitalism. And I think that's my favorite because I really got to talk about everything that I've been thinking about in a very, I think, hopefully lighthearted and funny tone. And what I wanted to prioritize in that poem was how money also guides everything we do now over ethics and how we're pressured to become economic agents. But at the end of the day, we still do have agency. And having that bit of hope at the end of the poem also felt really good because I was reaching the end of the editing process in the book.
I love that. Thank you for sharing. I feel like the whale poem was also my favorite in the book as a reader. So it's really nice to hear.
Awesome.
Can you give our viewers a writing prompt based on Shadow of Race?
Yes, I can. I wrote it down somewhere. So write about something that you love that is at risk due to climate change and how your own actions impact it. For example, this might be a bird in your neighborhood or your city if it's especially vulnerable to climate disasters.
I love that. I'm going to try it.
Awesome. You have to send me the poem if it works.
Okay. Can we talk a bit about your writing process?
Yes. So I'm one of those terrible writers who does wait for inspiration sometimes. And as I was saying before, I was waiting for additional information so I can actually write the whale poem. But now that I am starting to work on my second collection, I'm trying to be a little more disciplined about it and not just wait for inspiration. And I'm doing this by trying to free write more frequently. And that's what I did when I was in the middle of writing this book, when I also wanted to sort of get it done as soon as possible. And aside from free writing, I would also have this big document called Fragments 2, because Fragments 1 got too overwhelming to look at. And that's where I store all of my research and my ideas and also my free writing. And so when I'm feeling creative or ready to tackle those big topics or big ideas, like the economic worth of a whale, I try to do additional research and revise over and over again until I'm done. But generally, my creativity really ebbs and flows. I go through phases of not writing at all, then only rewriting, and then only revising. And so that cycle, I've noticed, is a pattern in my life. And as much as I beat myself up about not writing sometimes, I have to keep living and waiting for my creativity to come back.
What are your best strategies for revision?
My best strategy is opening up another document and rewriting each line of the poem in paragraph format. And so I got this tip from Safia El Hello, and she got it from somebody else. So I can't really point you to the direct source, but I find that rewriting a poem over and over again is the best way to really pay attention to each word and its role in the poem. So that's what I typically do when I'm revising. And so the whale poem, just to go back to that again, that took me so long because it's already such a long poem, and revising it over and over again was very tiring.
That sounds like a really involved process.
It is. But I think it's the best thing that works for me.
Is there anything I haven't asked that you wish I had asked?
I think a lot of people now are interested in, or at least when you come out with a book, they're always asking about what you're working on now, or what like your next book is going to be about. And so I have started work on my next collection, and I'm very excited about it because although I feel like I achieved basically everything I wanted to talk about in Shadow Price, I'm still really interested in the economics behind the climate crisis and also the roles that each person plays in this world. Because I was originally thinking of putting The Last Poet in the World into a series where I talk about different roles, but that not ended up working out. And so that's something that I'm going to tackle in the next book.
I love that. I'm so excited to see more poetry from you. I've been following you for a long time now, and I always love everything I find online. So very exciting.
Thank you. I hope you enjoy it.
And thank you so much for coming on Tightwires. I know it was kind of out of the blue and also not at a great time.
No, it was absolutely a pleasure. I'm so glad that I got to do this with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for doing this, and have a great night.
You too. Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.